Yo, what's going on, Titan Clan? It is your boy King Tinex here, back with another video, and I do have to admit, like when it came on to doing this, it originally was going to go a drastically different route with like help from Neptune, but of course I ended up deciding to scrap that plot and go my own route, essentially trying to see what I could do, looking at these what if scenarios, especially when looking at Broly's history, the OG Broly, and considering like all of the mental damage that he ended up going through. I figured that there may be something to work with here in order to basically have it to where Asta could maybe, as a matter of fact, let me not. Let's just roll that intro real quick.
何としてでも勝つ何としてでも生きる
Now, in this version of events, Asta would actually be born with black hair. He would also have black eyes as well. From a young age, Asta would actually be recognized for having an incredible amount of strength. He would be a rather intelligent child too, considering the fact that he was part of an orphanage, or a church you could say. Even then, he was still considered to be quite the genius among his peers. He and Yuno, they would actually be seen as the highlights of the church. Yuno would have ended up awakening his wind magic early on, while Asta, he would be viewed as having little to no magic whatsoever, but his strength seemingly made up for it. Asta would still have hope that he could eventually awaken a form of magic one day, at least later on in his life. Perhaps when he got a grimoire, that would be when he would be able to finally awaken his magic, since he had heard from others that sometimes you wouldn't necessarily awaken your magic until after you got a grimoire, or well, your magic was very little at first, to the point where it was seemingly nothing until you got a grimoire. Asta would have that hope in mind. Asta would refuse to believe that he was monolith. But one day, Yuno and Asta, they would actually, be walking back to the orphanage. They would have had groceries for the kids back there. They were basically bringing these groceries back for the church so that the kids would actually be able to have a bit of a solid meal. It was in the winter time as well, so the potatoes that they would usually harvest, it just would not work at this sort of time. Asta would hear a couple of people talking about their desires being to be part of the nobles' realm, due to the fact that, well, of course, the nobles treated them like garbage. They were poor, they could not afford the luxuries of the nobles at all, and the nobles, they literally had some of the strongest mana as well, or like magic types as well. Hearing this, Asta would think about it, and he would realize that he had a new desire. This desire would be to become the Wizard King. This would have been after he found out about the discrimination against the commoners that the nobles seemed to hold. Asta wanted to change that. He wanted to create an easier life for all of the kids within the orphanage too. Asta ate more than most kids after all, meaning they needed more food in general, and with how scarce the food seemingly was at times, it was hard for that to even happen. Sometimes Asta would even have to go out hunting to get his own amount of food, just to be able to quiet his stomach. That was part of why he was so strong as well, because of the fact that he would often be hunting wild animals, bringing them back to the church and having Sister Lily cook them. But while walking back to the orphanage, the duo would end up encountering a thug. They would have been trudging through the snow at this time as well. Asta would witness this thug realize something about Yuno. They would pay attention to Yuno's necklace and walk over, snatching it from Yuno's neck. Yuno would try to fight back, but he would find himself to be too weak. The thug would mention how this necklace seemed to be valuable and that he could probably get a pretty penny off of this at the pawn shop. Asta would be angered by this and he would fight the thug as well in order to get back Yuno's necklace. The thug would attempt to simply fling Asta away, but it would turn out that Asta was more resilient than he thought. The thug would begin to even use his own magic on Asta, due to how much of a burden Asta was becoming. Asta's strength was unusual for a child. His punches actually hurt, but it wasn't anything that the thug could not necessarily handle though. So of course the thug would just keep Asta restrained with his magic while trying to leave the scene. But at this moment, Asta would actually begin to have a flashback of something. It would be odd at first, but Asta would be witnessing somebody dangling him in the air, or at least it would be from Asta's perspective. His hands were small for some reason as well, and he felt absolutely hopeless. He was stabbed through the chest and he was left to die at that moment. For some reason though, he was still alive, breathing, but he was breathing quite shallowly. The area around him would begin to grow bright as it looked like it was getting destroyed for some reason. He couldn't explain what was going on in all honesty, but a surge of energy would actually cover his baby form, with there being an extreme will to live at that moment. He couldn't understand why he was having such a surge of energy, but the wound that was dealt to Asta for some reason was actually healing at that moment as well. Asta's flashback would end right then and there, but the power displayed in that dream would consume Asta at that moment. Asta, with one goal in mind, would actually break out of the thug's restraints. Faster than the thug could even react, Asta would fly over to the thug's back. He would snap their neck. Yuno would have been afraid of Asta seeing this. Asta would go out of that state though almost immediately after, and he would be breathing heavily, not being aware of what he had just done. He would be spooked out seeing the dead body of the thug, but he would slowly yank the necklace away from the thug's hand. Asta would hand the necklace over to Yuno. Yuno would of course have been hesitant at first, afraid of what Asta would do to him, but he would still take the necklace in the end, and the two would return home. After that day, Asta would seemingly have awakened his own form of magic. It would appear in the form of a green ball of energy. The kids would surround Asta and mention how cool his magic seemed to be. Asta would be happy to have finally awakened his own form of magic that day. Yuno wouldn't have mentioned that event to Sister Lily though, and Father Orsai. Well, of course, beyond Asta fighting to get his necklace back from a thug, hence why the two had some scratch marks and bruises. Yuno did not want to necessarily mention the whole part about Asta going into some strange state and then killing the thug in an instant because, well, he was afraid of triggering that form again. Asta, when it came onto his injuries, would end up just having more scratches than anything though. Yuno didn't know what would happen if he told Asta the truth about that day, because, well, of course, there was a chance it might trigger what he saw as a monster once again. But Yuno would just simply keep a close eye on Asta from that day moving forward. Over the years, Asta and Yuno would practice with their magical abilities in order to become as strong as possible. Yuno would have noticed that the monster that he had witnessed attack the thug also many years ago showed no signs of actually coming back, but he would still train as hard as possible. He would train in order to fend off against that monster in case they ever awakened again. He didn't want to simply leave Asta hanging like that. He knew that Asta was his friend and all, but he could not necessarily have it to where if Asta went back into that state, there would be nobody to actually counter it. That state Asta was in simply was far too unpredictable to leave unattended to. There needed to at least be one counter to it, and Yuno was going to be that counter at the very least. Asta would be none the wiser though. Asta's goal was to become Wizard King, so he figured that he needed to be strong in order to do so. That, and it was seemingly in his nature to strive to become as strong as possible. It was just that he had more of a goal to push himself even harder and to strive for greatness. On the day of the Grimoire acceptance ceremony, Asta would fail to receive a Grimoire though. People would look at Asta's pathetic state and begin to laugh at him. Asta would grow frustrated hearing the laughter of everybody. Hearing the laughter pointed towards him, he would whisper a couple of times for them to simply stop laughing at him. It was annoying. The sounds of a crying baby would begin to drown out the laughing though, upsetting Asta even more. Asta's eyes would begin to shift colors. His hair would begin to stand up. Asta would suddenly yell, demanding for everyone to shut their mouths already. Yuno would recognize the state Asta was in, and he would quickly try to calm down his foster brother. He would personally remove Asta from that environment, with the people within the tower also now becoming silent from that surge of energy that Asta had just released, wondering just what kind of creature Asta was, because to them, they weren't able to necessarily sense any mana coming off of Asta, but they were able to understand that power Asta had just released was nothing to joke about. They would have especially been unfamiliar with seeing somebody exert such a powerful presence. This powerful presence being something that would only be recognized by magic captains and the Magic King himself, or well, Wizard King. Asta would calm himself down and his hair would drop back down to its normal state afterwards. Yuno would sigh in relief, seeing Asta calm down. Finally, he was able to avoid a catastrophic event from happening just then. Their troubles wouldn't be over though, as somebody would begin to chain Yuno up. Asta would be shocked seeing this, and he would begin to break through the restraints. Chains would wrap around Asta as well though. The culprit would reveal themselves to actually be a black-haired individual with a scar around his face. Rochi was his name, and he would reveal the fact that they had planned on taking Yuno's grimoire. Their boy received a 4-leaf grimoire, and due to how rare those sorts of stuff were, he could probably sell it for a pretty great profit. There were nobles who collected this sort of stuff as well. Asta would refuse to let that happen though. Without a grimoire, Yuno would never be able to achieve his dream of becoming a magic knight. Who knows, maybe they could be competing for a Wizard King as well. Well, of course, Yuno did seemingly have that dream at times. Yuno would have mentioned his dream of becoming Wizard King at times as well, but it wouldn't have been to the same extent as canon though. Yuno was his rival, and he would never let his rival be crippled by such a scum. Asta would power up, going into that state once again. Yuno's face would pale seeing this. Asta would break out of the change with no effort whatsoever, and he would grab the man's face. He He would smash Revchi's head into the ground multiple times over before leaving him with a concussion. He would stomp on the man a couple of times too. Right when Asta was about to kill him, Yuno would try to hold back Asta. He would plead for Asta to stop and come back to a sense of normality, a sense of reality, or something along those lines. Asta would hear his friends' pleas, and his pupils would return to their normal black selves. Okay, that sounds a bit racist. Basically, Asta's pupils would return back to their normal color, and his power would go back to normal levels as well. Revchi would have been left in an unconscious and critically injured state. Asta would question what he had just done. This time around, he would have been aware of the state he was in, but it was as if he had little to no control over it. He let his emotions take over at that moment, and that was seemingly the result. Asta wanted to get better control of that state though. He had recognized the strength from this form, and he found that it would be useful in the long run, but the lack of control would be an issue. So for the next 6 months, Asta would practice with what he believed to be some sort of light magic, or at least a variant of it. Asta would find that increasing his physical strength in turn also helped with the strength of his energy attacks. Asta would end up developing a signature move during this 6-month period. He remembered seeing it in one of his dreams, which were becoming more and more unusual over time. It involved him charging up a green ball of energy from around his body, before gathering that energy into one spot, that being the palm of his hand. He would wave his hand forward, firing the attack at whatever was his opponent, and he would find that it would be quite powerful. This move, Asta would eventually evolve into where he would be able to do it in both of his hands simultaneously during this 6-month period. Asta would also learn to fly during this period of time as well, becoming quite agile in it. Once the 6-month period was over with, Asta and Yuno would prepare to head off to the capital. There, they would actually participate in a magical knight's exam. Asta would have rammed Yuno, and he would have simply flown the two of them to the exams rather than simply walking. The two would find that it was actually a far faster method of travel. While waiting for the exams to start, a flock of anti-birds would surround Asta. This would confuse him. People would begin to think that Asta simply had a poor mana pool, and they would begin to laugh at him once again. Asta would quickly emit a powerful aura though, causing for most of the brains to flee, and for the people to become quiet. Asta would find no need to actually entertain these people. His focus was the Magical Knight's exam, and once the exams had officially commenced, Asta and many other competitors, they would be handed brooms as part of their first test. Asta would find no need for the broom though, as he would simply be able to fly on his own, which would impress the captains. To them, it seemed like Asta already managed to learn about Monoskin, and he had gained a proper grasp of it as well. For a magic knight, that wasn't all that impressive, but Asta was only an examinee. Various other tests would be handed out to the competitors, such as target practice, essentially them shooting a magical blast at a target. Needless to say, Asta would have no trouble with it. For most of the exams, Asta would show himself to be worth the magical captain's time, but there would be something bugging each and every last one of them. They couldn't sense a lick of mana emitting from Asta. A random opponent would eventually face Asta in a match, this being to show how well they could use their magic in combat. Seke, the bronze magic user, would have originally planned on sticking close to Asta in order to look good in front of the captains when he noticed a bunch of anti-birds surround Asta in the beginning. He thought that Asta was simply going to be an easy opponent, and that by sticking around Asta he would be able to make himself look better. But of course, that plan went down the drain when he saw how capable Asta was. As soon as he had seen Asta emit that powerful aura in front of the audience, the people that were originally laughing at Asta, whispering, and the anti-birds would have, of course, made their way over to Asta as well when they had noticed that he seemed to have a lack of magic. People, of course, would have laughed at him during this time. Seki would have thought that Asta was easy meat, but no, it turned out that his hypothesis was wrong. He turned out to be a monster. It seemed that Asta had no magic, but at the same time he had more magic than most. It was a complete paradox in Sake's opinion. It made no sense for Asta to have this little mana, to the point where he was unable to even sense it. But Asta was able to do this many things. It made no sense, but Seki planned on just dealing with another opponent. At first he thought Asta wasn't able to do much, of course. But, well, Asta would have proved everybody wrong throughout all of the exams. Every time that people thought that Asta seemingly had a minute mana pool, Asta would continuously prove them wrong. It was really a head scratcher for many other magical captains as well. When it came on to Seki, he realized that Asta was strong, and that it would not be a good decision to even bother challenging him to a fight in the matches either. So of course, he would just go for somebody more gullible than Asta at the time. When it came on to Asta's opponent, they would have actually been a noble, who believed themselves to actually be above Asta. The fact he couldn't sense any magic off of Asta made him believe that Asta, he simply just had a good control over the little mana he had. The noble would have had crystal magic. They originally thought that Asta wouldn't be able to break through their defenses, but Asta would shatter each and every last one of the attacks thrown at him. Asta would quickly take down the noble afterward. Yuno would have taken his challenger, another noble, down in what seemingly was just a span of a couple of seconds. A couple of the captains would raise their hands when it came on to who wanted Asta on their squad. Other captains were on the edge though when it came on to Asta due to the unknown factors of the commoner, such as his mana pool. They sensed no magic whatsoever from him. Asta would choose the Black Bulls in the very end though, since Yami seemed to be the strongest one out of the captains, at least physically, and he could respect that. Yami would laugh hearing this and have Finral teleport all of them back to the Black Bulls headquarters. There, Asta would meet the rest of his new team. Asta would introduce himself to the crew members, and one individual with seemingly black and white hair, and the white hair in the middle while there was black all around the rest, basically the sides and all of that. They would introduce themselves as Magna, and they would actually approach Asta, mentioning how the boy needed to go through some initiation first before he could officially be recognized as a Black Bull. Asta would raise an eyebrow but shrug in the end. Magna would throw fireballs at Asta, which would be countered by simple ki blasts from the boy. Asta would charge at Magna right after and kick him in the stomach before punching him in the chest. The attacks would feel as if Magna was being hit by boulders. Magna would be on the floor, incapable of moving from the sudden pain that had been inflicted onto him. Vanessa would walk over to Asta, congratulating him on his victory, although mentioning how he could have gone a little bit easier on Magna, and hand him his Black Bull's robe, and she would even fix up his bandana to have it to where the Black Bull's insignia would be on there as well. Asta would have finally been officially recognized as a Black Bull's member. Asta would be happy. Asta would basically be happy to know this, and he would also end up going to meet some other members. He would have ended up encountering Noel, and he would mention how he was nothing but a filthy commoner, while she was a noble. Therefore, he was to treat her with the utmost respect. In all honesty, he should have been bowing down to her. Asta would be annoyed hearing this, and he would clutch his fists, but he would breathe, calming himself down. She wasn't worth his time, but hearing the fact that she considered herself to be so high and mighty in comparison to him, that just irked Asta for some reason. And he would have flashbacks to that strange individual holding him by the leg when he was a baby. He didn't know what was going on back in that flashback, that dream, whatever that was. He just couldn't put his finger on it. But once she mentioned that she was a noble, and all of how he was to bow down to her, how she was so much better than him, how she was above the rest of this crew, that just really threw Asta over the edge. She wasn't worth his time though. If he stayed in that environment, he may end up losing himself. Of course, later on in the day, Asta would find Noel trying to practice with her magic, but she would be failing miserably. He would laugh seeing her display a lack of control over her own magic, especially with how she talked earlier about being a noble. Weren't nobles supposed to have superior genetics when it came onto magic? Weren't nobles supposed to be like at the very top of the food chain when it came onto magic? So why was she having so much difficulty when it came onto using her own magic? It seemed like she was just causing chaos around the field. She would have been irritated hearing Asta laugh at her, so she would end up letting her emotions take control, and at that moment, she would actually get consumed by her own magic. This would cause for chaos to surround the area. Asta would fly up and drag Noel out to the spell though that she had accidentally made, which would cancel out the effects in the process. Asta's first mission would be to do some boar hunting though, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing this wrong, but Soshi in Soshi village, which in all honesty Asta would find to be a waste of his skills, especially with what he was able to do just the other day when it came on to his efforts with, of course, Noel. He actually managed to take her out of her own spell, drag her out of her own spell, and basically save her from causing any more damage. But now they wanted him to go boar hunting. Right. Noel would apparently be coming with him as well, which would displease Asta even more. Asta would reject the mission, but Yami would walk over to Asta, grabbing onto his forehead. Asta would not be intimidated by Yami at all though, and simply grasp onto Yami's hand, pulling it away from his head. He would stand up and look at Yami. Yami would be trying to let off a menacing aura, but he would realize that he and Asta were actually around the same height. They were on eye level. This would have surprised Yami. This was the first time he had realized that. He had realized that Asta was tall, but he wasn't expecting for Asta to be this tall. And not only that, but Asta had a similar build to him, although Asta had slightly less muscle, and he seemingly was more ripped as well. He had less body fat on his frame for some reason. Asta would have an intense staring contest with Yami. The two would emit powerful auras, but Asta would begin to become greater than Yami's own. Yami would begin to sweat. This was the first time this had ever happened. Yami would eventually be forced to submit, and he would actually come to a compromise with Asta. He would promise to give Asta a more interesting mission for next time, but at least just do this one mission for right now, since it was going to be his first mission after all. Asta would eventually accept this proposition and head off with Noelle. Asta would have grabbed Noelle, and Noelle would begin to blush at seeing Asta actually grab onto her. Asta would have even had her close to his chest as well, as they would have flown over to the village. They would realize that it was covered in mist though. Asta would use a ball of energy in order to find his way to the village area. Once he had arrived at the center of the village, Asta would find villagers being held hostage by a group of mages. They didn't appear to be friendly either. Asta would shoot down the mages with a quick barrage of ki blasts. Not enough to kill them. There wasn't enough strength in these blasts to actually kill these mages, but it would be enough to actually knock them out. He would make his way over to the leader of the group. Noelle would be attending to the villagers while Asta dealt with Heath Grice. Asta would demand to know for the purpose here, but the leader would simply continuously dodge Asta's questions. They would try to get the upper hand against Asta, but Asta's pure strength alone would overpower everything that he tried to throw at Asta. Asta would begin to break Heath's body afterward. Heath would attempt to crawl away in fear, but Asta would drag him back. He would begin to break even more of his bones, but this time one by one. He would be demanding information from Heath if he wanted to avoid having even more of his bones broken. Heath would realize what sort of situation he was in, and instead take his own life. This way, he would be able to protect his leaders, his higher-ups' information, his intel. He didn't want this sort of intel slipping out to these magical knights. Asta would tisk in frustration. But an anti-bird would eventually arrive though, resting themselves on Asta's head right after. They would drop a stone in Asta's hands, leaving him with a curious face. That being for what this stone was, what this stone meant, and why was this anti-bird on his head? Where did they even come from? Did they just follow him all the way here or something? Anyways, it didn't matter to Asta. What really mattered was that Asta and Noelle would actually return back to the Black Bull space after having completed the mission, and they would receive praise from Yami for how well it seemingly went. Yami would give the two their salaries, and Vanessa would mention how they could probably go on a shopping trip to spend their very first salaries. Asta would be excited to actually experience this, and he wished that he could bring the Hage kids with him, because he would notice that the kids would honestly enjoy this quite a bit, probably even more than him. They could have bought a lot of things at this shopping district, but while there they would encounter a thief snatching an old woman's purse. The woman would have called out for help, but the thief would have been running wildly. They would have been trying to escape this whole time, trying to avoid getting caught by magical knights or any other form of authority. Asta would be quick to catch the thief though, which would actually impress everybody there. Well, of course, until they realized that Asta was a black bull. Judging from his insignia on his bandana, and his magical robe. Impressive, but they felt that Asta was just going to be one of those rowdy black bulls. Asta would go on to find himself doing a dungeon raid after that, though. Well, this being after Yami mentioned how the Wizard King specifically requested for Asta to investigate this. Asta would have heard about this and realized that, hey, this actually sounds fun for once. This actually sounded like it could be using the skills for something useful. It seemed that even the Wizard King was able to realize that Asta actually had quite a bit of capabilities, which would be very flattering to Asta. Asta would actually be partnered with Noel and Luck on this mission. Luck would abandon the pair, though. He wanted to explore more on his own and hopefully find some strong opponents to fight as well. After Luck left the duo of Asta and Noel, they would actually encounter the 3 members from the Golden Dawn: Klaus, Yuno, and Mimosa Vermilion, to be more specific. And it turns out that when it came onto Mimosa and Noel, they would have actually been cousins. When it came onto Asta and Yuno, they would have been reunited with each other at that moment, and they would actually greet each other, wondering how their teams had been treating them so far. Yuno would be glad to see that Asta was still keeping himself together, and that he had yet to go into that state again. The reunion would be cut short by Yuno's superior, Klaus, who would look down on Asta for his status as a commoner and a black bull. He would have also heard about how Asta had other options back at a magical entrance exam, but he decided to go for the worst team of all, the Black Bulls, so Klaus would also view Asta as an idiot for this. Klaus would begin to argue with Asta, wondering why he was here, but Asta would get agitated. He would choose to ignore the man in the end, though, which would actually relieve Yuno. The Golden Dawn would go their separate ways from there on. The Golden Dawn would set out to conquer the dungeon, while the Black Bulls would be finding the center of the dungeon as well. Asta and Noel would be searching for Luck during this time. They would eventually find him fighting against an unfamiliar mage. They didn't appear to be part of the Clover Kingdom either. Asta would realize Luck was struggling against his opponent, and he would quickly intervene. Noel would mention how their main priority right now was actually to conquer the dungeon, not fight a bunch of other people. Their opponent would cover the room with a thick fog, though, and he would attempt to escape. Asta would sense his energy, though, and he would let his sensory abilities guide him to a Lotus. Lotus would be surprised, seeing that Asta was actually able to maneuver around the smoke that he produced. And he would actually find it unusual that Asta also didn't appear to be producing any form of magic that he could sense. It was almost as if Asta had no mana whatsoever, and he was using a completely different power source. Lotus would be dragged back down into the ground by Asta. Lotus would try to escape once more, but Asta would knock him out. Asta and the others would make their way to the center of the dungeon, and they would immediately save Yuno from an attack. Asta would focus his attention on their latest assailant, though, and they would get into a fighting stance. This opponent would have light purple hair, pink eyes, and there are magic stones embedded into their forehead. The last part was a bit of an odd sight to see, but Asta would assume that it was just a fashion accessory. Multiple clones of their opponent would be created, in which Asta would destroy every last one of them. This would actually impress Klaus, or was it Klaus, or something along those lines. He was not expecting for Asta to actually have such strength. It also appeared that Asta seemingly had a variation of light magic, which was rare in and of itself. The way that Asta was utilizing it as well was a strange sight to see. Asta's lack of a magical force was what confused Klaus the most, though. Considering all the different properties that Asta had, he had light magic, yet he was seemingly producing no mana. He seemingly had no mana whatsoever. So, how did that work? He also had no grimoire either, so this was just a head scratcher for Klaus. There was so many different odd parts to Asta that he just couldn't wrap his head around it. Myers would actually go on to try and create a large crystal sword. He would try to launch it at Asta. Asta would break it though. Asta would actually grab onto the crystal sword and would break it with his bare hands. Asta would now launch himself at Myers right after. Myers would attempt to create an armor around himself, which would at least dampen the impact from Asta's attack. Myers would still feel a heavy amount of Asta's strength though, and he would actually be knocked unconscious. Klaus would restrain Myers with his magic, while Asta would open the door to the treasury room. The group would be amazed seeing the amount of different treasures within the room. Myers would have woken up at this time though from his unconscious state, and he would attempt to actually try a new fighting strategy against the Clover Kingdom. Asta would show that Myers' efforts would have been fruitless in the end though. Asta would protect himself from Myers' attacks by taking a bit of inspiration from earlier on in the fight with how Myers ended up creating quite a bit of armor around himself. Basically what could be compared to like a Susanoo from, well, Naruto, you could say. Although a bit of a stretch, you get what I'm saying. Asta would develop an aura around himself here in the form of a sphere. It would be similar to a shell, and where it would protect Asta from each of the Diamond Mage's attacks. Asta would pummel Myers into the ground right after. Myers would be using his healing spells in order to reverse the injury that Asta was giving him. Asta, noticing this, would actually smirk before using the move that he ended up developing during that 6-month period, also many months ago. Well, the one that I mentioned earlier. He would have eventually ended up creating a name for this move. This move he would have dubbed as a Racer Cannon at this moment, and he would have used it against Myers. He would have left him in a near-death state. The dungeon would begin to collapse though, and the crew would collect as many valuable items as possible within this rush before heading out. After the mission, Asta would actually begin consuming a copious amount of food, this being all the stuff that he ended up hunting in order to make a good meal for himself. While eating though, he would actually be approached by one of the Black Bulls, mentioning how he was to inform the Wizard King of the fact that how his mission went. Basically it went like this. One of the Black Bulls would come over to Asta, mentioning how, hey, you basically need to go to the Wizard King, go to the Magic Knight's headquarters, and basically talk to the Wizard King. The Wizard King wanted to find out how well Asta did on this mission when it came on to, of course, looking about the dungeon, basically discovering all these different properties to the dungeon. And of course, Asta would oblige and head over to the Magic Knight's HQ. He would be followed by Noel though, and the two would end up meeting up with Yuno, Klaus, and Mimosa. The Wizard King would be the one to actually greet them and request to see the magical attributes that they acquired during the mission. Asta unfortunately wouldn't be able to show anything though, which would be a sad sight, but when it came on to Yuno, he would be able to show what he was able to gain from this mission. Julius would be curious as to how Asta's magic worked though, from his understanding, Asta didn't necessarily have a grimoire, but he was stronger than most magical knights. It was as if Asta didn't require a magical grimoire at all. Another thing that interested Julius was the fact that Asta didn't seem to produce any mana, yet he was capable of producing what seemingly looked like light magic. He wanted to learn more about Asta, but that would be for another day. Asta and his comrades, they will be offered an invitation to the War Merits Conferment ceremony. This was basically a ceremony to honor magical knights who had the greatest achievements in recent times. They would accept, and once the ceremony was over with, their group would partake in a banquet. They would do their best to ignore the sneers of honorary magic knights, but Asta would begin to grow agitated the more he heard them basically talk bad about him and the others, especially when it came onto Yuno, his foster brother, the person that he had grown up with. He would begin to reach his boiling point. What really pushed him over the edge though was when Noelle's own siblings approached her and began to humiliate her. This was the first time Asta had seen Noelle in such a hopeless state. He would have realized that he would have ended up realizing at this moment that the real reason for why Noelle acted so prideful around the others was because of the fact that she was constantly being beaten down by her siblings. Asta would release a powerful aura at that moment and glare at each and every last one of Noelle's siblings. A chill would crawl up everybody's back at that moment. They had no idea what was in store at that moment. And that is how I am going to end part 1, people. As you can probably tell from now on, my voice is dead. This is like 47 minutes long now, and you guys already know the deal. Hit the like button. If you guys like my content, you may as well subscribe. Leave a comment below. Oh, and please share the video to others who may be interested in this sort of content. It is your boy King Darren X, signing out. Peace.